To understand Édouard Glissant as a radical thinker, we have to know who he is, what we mean by thinker and radical, and what some of his ideas and concepts are. A Martinican who lived from 1928 to 2011, Édouard Glissant is a leading representative of Francophone Caribbean theory. His poetry, novels, and theoretical texts have influenced literary criticism, linguistics, and post-colonial studies, rethinking the nature of relations as well as the ethical obligations those relations entail. Thinking relationally allows Glissant to reconsider identity, understanding the human as informed and enriched by others. It also allows him to reconsider community, understanding communities as composed of many relations, cultures, languages, and worldviews. In 2014, the National Library of France designated Glissant's archives a national treasure. The archives at the National Library hold Glissant's writings from the 1970s until 2011. No doubt this is an honor, but it also takes Glissant's writings away from Martinique or the Caribbean. I open with this historical note for two reasons. First, to consider whether or not it would be more just for Glissant's corpus to be in the Caribbean, or at least more accessible to Caribbean thinkers, given the colonial pattern of material and epistemological extraction of the Americas to Europe. And second, to introduce us to the idea that thinking always emerges from and writes to particular times and places. If we think of thinking or theory this way, which is not always how it has been considered in the history of Western philosophy, then we admit that this thinking is about neither the eternal nor the universal. On the contrary, thinking must be situated. Glissant writes in the opening lines of the 1990 Poetics of Relation, perhaps his most famous book, "Thinking thought usually amounts to withdrawing into a dimensionless place in which the idea of thought alone persists. But thought in reality spaces itself out into the world. It informs the imaginary of peoples, their varied poetics, which it then transforms, meaning in them its risk becomes realized." Let me read that again. Thinking thought usually amounts to withdrawing into a dimensionless place in which the idea of thought alone persists. But thought in reality spaces itself out into the world. It informs the imaginary of peoples, their varied poetics, which it then transforms, meaning in them its risk becomes realized. Thinking, theory, or philosophy for Glissant, then, are not abstract or individual occurrences, the lone philosopher contemplating in Book 10 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, the monk in his study, or Rodin's famous sculpture of the man with his chin resting on his knuckles. All of these examples present thinking as lacking dimensions and as lacking relations. But for Glissant, thinking always contains textures and always involves others. Thought, in reality, circulates among peoples. Again, we are not talking about the lone genius here. We are talking about stories shared and relayed among others in quotidian ways. When a grandmother teaches a child how to bead or how to sew, that is thinking. But it is not simply that thought is passed down or transmitted in a static way. Thinking, we recall from the quotation, is transformative. When I come into contact with someone from a different country, and when they call into question my own country, I have the opportunity to transform my thinking. Perhaps after learning how the United States violently acquired and demarcated what is now the border between Texas and Mexico, I begin to reimagine the maps of the world. The very way I see space changes because I realize that countries and borders have not always been as they are now. They are continually contested. In this way, they are not static, but in motion, or potentially changing, or alive. And finally, I might begin to see that a border is not just a thing, such as a wall or a gate. I might begin to sense more abstractly that a border is a way of managing and regulating difference, most saliently, people who look different from what is considered normal. If, based on how my imaginary has shifted through thinking with others, I take this position, the position that there is something artificial to the way my country draws its borders, then I become vulnerable to criticism from those who want to maintain a status quo, from those who are comfortable with the familiar drawing of the lower 48 United States, say, a drawing I had on a placemat as a child and looked at every evening while eating dinner with my family. If, through transformation, I am thus vulnerable to such people, who are, we should note, the people in power today, then we start to see how thinking, in Glissant's sense, opens us up not just to criticism, as with an interlocutor, but censorship, as against a state power. Indeed, keeping with our question on the artifice of borders, we see such censorship at play when a country tries to limit speech around important political questions of one's time, such as the recent Israel Anti-Boycott Act. From this example of state power being exercised against certain speech, certain thinking, we see very clearly why Glissant would note that in thinking, risks become realized. But you might say, as you are watching this now, that the fact that one conceptualizes thinking itself as risky and makes some political stances does not necessarily make one a radical thinker. Let us consider just what this entails then. By describing Glissant as a radical thinker, I mean to invoke the term in two ways. First, in an etymological sense, coming from the Latin radicalis, meaning of or having roots. Second, in a political sense, meaning something like on the left, as when we say Marx was a radical thinker. To begin with the first sense, Glissant is a thinker of the root. I am from Minnesota. The root systems I grew up around, say of coniferous trees, provided a stable base as well as a nutrient supply for these trees to grow vertically. Glissant, from Martinique, is often presenting roots in a different way. He was familiar with plants that a botanist would describe as rhizomatic, meaning that the roots grew not a tree, but more roots, and that the roots were used not to grow vertically, but to spread horizontally in the storage of nutrients. Ginger is an example. But Glissant would turn this botanical point into a conceptual and political point. In conversation with the French theorist Deleuze and Guattari around the rhizome, Glissant perhaps informed, and certainly drew on, Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the rhizome with respect to politics and especially with respect to identity. This gets us to the second way in which Glissant is a radical thinker. In his aforementioned Poetics of Relation, Glissant makes a distinction between root identity and relational identity. Root identity takes as important a place of origin, and it holds this root as sacred. We see root identity at play today in ethnocentric nationalism, when a particular nation-state adheres to a myth of its own people and elevates that myth over and against all other competing stories. An easy example is white nationalism, but let us consider a slightly harder case. Consider the myth that the U.S. is a country of immigrants, that we were all immigrants once, to quote a bumper sticker I saw on a walk the other day. This myth at once obscures the attempted genocide of the indigenous peoples who were already in what became the country and therefore not immigrants, and further, it completely misses the fact of forcibly removing, shipping, and enslaving African peoples. The "we are all immigrants" myth, then, is perhaps the most succinct way of denying the twin pillars of our country, indigenous genocide and transatlantic slavery. Moreover, it is utilized as if we always welcomed a variety of peoples, as opposed to selectively allowing certain populations into the country, managing others through borders of different kinds, as we do now. In sum, the claim "we are all immigrants" is a moral convenience if you look like I do. It allows a kind of legitimacy of entitlement to land at the expense of the roots of those who previously lived on the land and of those whose attempts to re-root after forced deracination were and still are so often violently denied. In this way, paradoxically, the root identity of some is so often uprooting for others. So Glissant presents an alternative. As opposed to root identity, Glissant also describes relational identity. Relational identity does not tell a myth of origin or a creation story. Instead, the word Glissant uses around it are circulation, weave, and giving instead of comprehending or grasping. But this remains a bit vague. To understand this concept, and by extension to understand further how Glissant is a radical thinker in the second political sense, we must have a feel for his concept of errancy. so allow this one digression into the concept. Let us start very slowly with the word itself. In err or we hear error or mistake. We might also hear other colloquial terms such as errand, meaning a short journey on which an inferior is sent on behalf of a superior. It makes sense, then, that those who are errant are read as errors, as aberrations, as deviants, as unimportant, as subordinate, and are thus marginalized. They are told they are mistaken, or they are told they are off the deep end, on the wrong track, misguided. Anyone who has been in a queer relationship, for instance, understands this. Glissant, by contrast, endorses errancy as follows. A first key point is that, for Glissant, errancy is not a renunciation. To err is not to withdraw, a lone ethical individual beyond the complications of the world. There is no forest hut, no monastery, no island retreat for the errant. The question is one of diversion within entanglements. This does not mean that one must deny one's past or one's language. The question is how one moves precisely within one's surroundings, within one's non-chosen constraints, such as one's country and one's language and one's situation. Also, to read errancy as I have presented it is not to suggest that it is somehow without norms. For one, insofar as errant practices are read as errors, as mistaken, errancy presupposes the norms from which it deviates. For another, insofar as it is an intentional practice, a deliberate movement, it aims to usher in alternative, and in that sense new, norms. We can think of errancy as the contestation of what is in the name of what could be. Glissant's wager is that those errant few, read correctly as rebelling against standard senses of what is good and beautiful, and thus understood to be shocking, carry with them the promise of making legible alternative political forms. This is slightly and importantly different from working within already legible terms, that is, the terms of institutions, of legal courts, of political parties, and other state apparatuses. As opposed to the vocabulary of institutions, in a decolonial move, Glissant is suggesting a vocabulary of imaginaries. He puts it this way, quote, "The rebel paves the way for such a shock, or at least its legibility, by refusing to be cramped by any tradition at all, even when the force of his rebellion comes from the defense of a tradition ridiculed or oppressed by another tradition that simply has more powerful means of action." Defending a marginalized tradition, then, is a way of making legible what is initially shocking. Okay, two more notes on this concept before I conclude. I want to present Glissant's errancy as a way to think about practices that divert or diffract attempts at identity-based totalization, the problem of root identity, and concretely the problem of nationalism. The error of errancy suggests a move away from a fixed attachment to home, a detour from the root identity of one group. As such, errancy would be part of a bearing practiced by those in a non-totalitarian community, what we might call a community open to, indeed responsive to, the interruptions of what it takes itself to be. This is a community open to migrants. It is a community that understands that others not only challenge what it takes itself to be, but also enrich it. Here we see the ethical and aesthetic points coming together. Second, Glissant presents errancy specifically as deviating from an identification with one's nation. This is an explicitly political claim. This thinking of errancy, he writes, this errant thought, silently emerges from the destructuring of compact national entities that yesterday were still triumphant, and from difficult, uncertain births of new forms of identity that call to us. What this looks like, concretely, includes identifying more with others than with myths of a chosen people we are taught to believe were a false, often a historical origin of how we came to be, the "we are all immigrants" myths say. If, then, there is a kind of exile to errancy, it lacks a sense of origin and instead wanders. It avoids a kind of territorial beginning. But Glissant is clear that errancy is also not exploration, so neither exile nor exploration, then. Errancy is better considered as an engagement with an entanglement, a construction within constraints. It avoids easy appeals to the past and instead does its best to listen and respond to those calls of others who open up an alternative identification. Errancy, then, poses a question of responsibility. Let me now summarize the claims I have made in this short presentation. I have argued that there is no thinking per se, that thinking is always situated in time, place, and address. I have also noted that such situated thinking, conducted with others, can lead one to unpopular positions, positions that speak truth to power and that challenge the constructions and presuppositions that those in power rely on, such as the fixed sense of borders or a clear story about how a nation has come to be. I have presented Glissant as a radical thinker not only because of his discussion of roots and rhizomes, but also because the risk of thinking with him includes a strong ethical and political challenge to the comfortable adoption of ready-made identities, a challenge presented through his concept of errancy. It is through shared stories, relayed knowledge, sewing, marching, speaking out, that Glissant invites us to errant identifications that weave textures of resistance in contexts we did not choose, but that we might change.